The video is grainy, but the terror is crystal clear. In November 2024, Bishop T.D. Jakes, the 67-year-old spiritual giant who has counseled presidents and built a global empire, is in the middle of a sermon at his Dallas megachurch. He finishes a sentence, lowers the microphone, and his body goes limp. Within seconds, he is surrounded by frantic aides. It looked like a medical episode. It was a miracle in real time. The news from the hospital would reveal that Jakes was preaching with only half his heart functioning, living on borrowed time in front of 30,000 witnesses. Before we uncover what really happened, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding about this story? The date was November 24, 2024. Bishop T.D. Jakes took the stage for what should have been an ordinary Sunday sermon at the Potter's House in Dallas. He was in his element, speaking with energy, engaging the congregation, doing what he'd done thousands of times before. "I still love to preach. I ain't tired of preaching," he told the crowd. He spoke of the joy of ministry, of how preaching often gives back more than it takes. He quoted Psalm 19 verse 14, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength, my Redeemer, let them go in peace." Those would be his final words before everything went silent. As he finished the prayer, the 67-year-old lowered his microphone. Then, in full view of 30,000 congregants and the global live stream, he began to convulse. His body went limp. Aides rushed the stage, surrounding him as the video feed was abruptly cut. Voices from the crowd shouted, "Back up and give him some space." Another voice urgently called for prayer. Jakes had no idea. In his own mind, he wasn't convulsing on a stage in Dallas. He was somewhere else entirely, a quiet, peaceful, serene space wrapped in clouds. "I was on my way out," he would later reveal. He didn't feel the numbness, the sharp pain, the classic warning signs of a heart attack. He just drifted off to sleep, unaware he was teetering on the edge of eternity. Church leadership quickly released a vague statement. Jakes had experienced a slight health incident and was stable. Social media erupted with speculation. Was it a stroke? His family, including daughter Sarah Jakes Roberts, posted an update calling it a reminder to cherish loved ones. But the full truth, the terrifying reality of what had happened inside the preacher's body, remained buried. For months, the public would not know the extent of the miracle that had just unfolded. They only knew that their bishop had almost died on live television. The church said he was stable. His family said he was recovering. But behind closed doors, doctors were preparing to reveal the kind of news that changes a life forever. What they found in that hospital room would rewrite everything. For 4 months after the collapse, the public knew nothing beyond vague reassurances. The church called it a slight health incident. Jakes himself, in a December video message, described a life-threatening calamity but would not name the enemy he'd faced. Speculation ran wild online: stroke, seizure, exhaustion. The silence was deafening, but the truth, when it finally came, was far more terrifying than anyone imagined. Then came March 26, 2025. In an exclusive interview with NBC's Today Show, Jakes finally revealed the full weight of what had happened inside his body. It wasn't a stroke. It wasn't exhaustion. It was a massive heart attack. The doctor had leaned over his hospital bed and delivered the news that would haunt Jakes. "You had a massive heart attack." The bishop was stunned. He didn't believe it at first. He'd felt none of the classic warning signs. No numbness, no sharp pain, no anything, he told Craig Melvin. "I just kind of drifted off to sleep. I didn't know what it was, but I almost died." What he didn't realize was that his body had been deceiving him in the most dangerous way possible. The medical reality was this: the right side of Jake's heart had completely stopped receiving blood. A clot had effectively closed off half his heart. The only reason he survived was adrenaline. As long as he was standing, preaching with the energy that had defined his ministry for 40 years, the adrenaline masked the catastrophe unfolding inside him. But the moment he sat down, that protective surge dropped, and the truth became undeniable. The doctors were blunt. 5 minutes later, I'd have been dead on arrival. Emergency surgery followed. Remarkably, Jakes remained awake throughout the entire procedure as surgeons worked to remove the clot that had nearly killed him. "Technology, it's amazing," he later reflected. But the technology wasn't what saved him. The timing was the miracle. If he had collapsed in his office, alone, no one would have known. Instead, it happened in front of 30,000 witnesses and a global live stream. The experience left Jakes with something unexpected, not trauma, but a strange sense of peace. He described floating in a quiet, peaceful, serene, white-enveloped, cloud-enveloped space. He wasn't in the chair on the stage. He was on his way out. It's hard for me to look at that video because they had to claw the microphone out of my hand, he admitted. But in my mind, I was in a quiet, peaceful, serene place. It was a glimpse of the other side. When Jakes returned to the pulpit on New Year's Eve, he walked back onto the very stage where he'd nearly died. The anxiety was overwhelming. I had a fair amount of anxiety about walking on this stage, standing in the same spot that I almost died in, he confessed. But he pushed through, delivering a triumphant message. Death had to back up off of me. He calls himself Bishop Lazarus now, a man raised from the dead. But the heart attack was only the beginning of a much larger story. Behind the scenes, another chapter was quietly unfolding, one that would eventually force Jakes to confront something far more difficult than his own mortality. The heart healed, but what happened next would change everything. The announcement that followed would shake the foundation of a 30,000-member empire to its core. And the answer to the question everyone was asking, what now, would prove more shocking than the collapse itself. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you never miss our next documentary. The heart attack was not the only crisis lurking beneath the surface. As Jakes recuperated in the hospital, a legal battle was brewing that threatened to unravel his reputation just as his body had betrayed him. The day after his collapse on stage, his legal team filed a defamation lawsuit against Dwayne Youngblood, a Pennsylvania minister. The suit alleged that Youngblood's intentional and malicious lies had taken a substantial emotional and physical toll on Jakes. The lawsuit explicitly connected the two events, the health crisis and the allegations. It claimed that on November 24th, the very day Jakes suffered the massive heart attack, he was also dealing with the weight of accusations that had been leveled against him. Jakes' attorneys accused Youngblood of making false claims of attempted sexual assault. The timing was devastating. Here was a man who had just preached with half his heart functioning, whose body had given out under the strain of years of ministry, and now he was being forced to defend his legacy in the midst of a medical emergency. Youngblood's intentional and malicious lies have taken a substantial emotional and physical toll on Bishop Jakes, the suit read. The implication was clear: the stress of the allegations may have contributed to the physical collapse that nearly killed him. But Jakes was not just fighting for his reputation in the courtroom. Behind closed doors, his family was preparing for something far more significant, a transition that would reshape the future of the Potter's house. The heart attack had forced a reckoning. For nearly half a century, Jakes had poured everything into his ministry. He had built a 30,000-member megachurch from the ground up. He had expanded across North Dallas, Fort Worth, and Denver. He had produced films, authored books, and built a media empire that reached millions. But the collapse on stage had shown him something he could no longer ignore. His body could not sustain this pace forever. I cannot afford, especially after November, to risk something happening to me, and you be sheep without a shepherd, Jakes would later tell his congregation. It was a confession of vulnerability from a man who had spent decades projecting strength. The health scare had forced him to confront what he had been avoiding for years, the need to pass the mantle to a new generation. And the decision he made would surprise everyone. The plan had actually been in motion for years, long before the heart attack. Jakes' daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband, Teutul Roberts, had moved to Dallas in 2022 and had served as assistant pastors since 2023. They were being groomed for this moment. The heart attack simply accelerated the timeline. But when Jakes finally made the announcement in April 2025, the emotional weight of the moment was unmistakable. He stood before his congregation and declared that his daughter and son-in-law would become the new senior pastors of the Potter's house. This is legacy, he told them, not because they are kin, but because they are the kind. The congregation applauded. Sarah Jakes Roberts, a New York Times best-selling author and CEO of Women Evolve, stood beside her father, visibly moved. I'm grateful, I'm honored, as your daughter. I'm so happy you're going to get some rest, she said. The moment was meant to be a celebration, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. But for those watching closely, there was an undercurrent of unease. Sarah and Teutul had already been co-pastors at ONE, a Potter's House church in Los Angeles and Potter's House of Denver. They had their own following, their own style, their own vision. Could they truly fill the shoes of the man who had become a global icon? For Jakes, the transition was framed as expansion, not departure. This elevation is not a departure but a rebirth, he insisted. I will never stop preaching and will continue to minister. This moment isn't an ending, it's an expansion. He would remain chairman of the board and spiritual overseer. He would continue his work with the T.D. Jakes Group, including real estate ventures and a new podcast partnership with iHeartMedia. But the daily pastoral duties, the preaching, the counseling, the shepherding of 30,000 souls, would belong to the next generation. The announcement was a masterclass in succession planning, but it left an unsettling question hanging in the air. Could the empire survive without the man who built it? The heart attack had given Jakes a glimpse of the other side. It had shown him what it felt like to float in that quiet, peaceful, serene, white-enveloped, cloud-enveloped space. He had come back with a new urgency, a new clarity about what mattered. But in the months following the announcement, that clarity would be tested. The transition was not just about passing the mantle, it was about trusting that the legacy he had built would endure. And as the Roberts prepared to step into their new roles, the weight of that expectation would prove heavier than anyone anticipated. The announcement was made. The successors were named. But the real test was only just beginning. What happened next would reveal whether the dynasty could truly survive the departure of its founder, or whether the church he built would begin to fracture under the weight of change. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who would enjoy uncovering forgotten Hollywood stories. The congregation had applauded. The cameras had captured the embrace. But as Sarah Jakes Roberts stepped into her father's shoes, the foundation beneath her began to shift. The passing of the torch was supposed to be a moment of triumph, a carefully orchestrated transition from one generation to the next. Instead, it became a crucible. Before the new chapter could truly begin, the old one refused to close quietly. The heart attack had forced Jakes to confront his mortality. But the transition forced him to confront something even more unsettling, the fragility of his life's work. In the months following the announcement, the weight of succession pressed down on the entire family. Sarah, at 36, was stepping into a role that would have intimidated even the most seasoned pastors. She had been open about her struggles, her teenage pregnancy, her journey to faith, her growth as a leader. "I'm scared, but I'm ready," she had told her father on that emotional Sunday. But being ready and being prepared for what was coming were two very different things. Then came April 2026. The news hit like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Sarah Jakes Roberts had fractured her neck in a trampoline accident while spending time with her daughter. The injuries were severe, fractures in her neck, spinal impact, doctors warning that she had nearly been paralyzed. The irony was devastating. Just months after her father had nearly died on stage, Sarah faced her own brush with mortality. The Potter's House, already adjusting to new leadership, was suddenly thrust into crisis mode. The woman who had just been entrusted with the future of a 30,000-member megachurch was now fighting to walk again. The church issued a statement. She was expected to make a full recovery, but she would be scaling back public appearances. The timing could not have been worse. The transition was barely underway, and now the new senior pastor was sidelined. Questions swirled. Could she continue? Would the church survive this series of catastrophes? It was the kind of pressure that would break most people. But Sarah had been forged in the fire of her father's legacy. She had watched him preach with half a heart. She had seen him collapse and rise again. Now it was her turn to endure. Meanwhile, the legal battle that had shadowed the transition was reaching its own conclusion. In October 2025, nearly a year after filing the defamation lawsuit against Dwayne Youngblood, T.D. Jakes voluntarily dismissed the case. The decision came after a failed effort to recover more than $76,000 in legal fees. The notice was brief, almost clinical. Pursuant to Rule 41A(1)(a)(2), Plaintiff Thomas Dexter Jakes hereby gives notice that the above-captioned action is voluntarily dismissed by consent of all parties. For a man who had spent his life fighting for justice, this was a calculated retreat. The accusations had never been proven. Jakes had vehemently denied them, calling the allegations knowingly and flagrantly false and stating that he was repulsed by these defamatory accusations. But the toll had been immense. The emotional and physical toll of this coordinated campaign of lies, designed to damage my reputation and legacy, has become overwhelming, he had written in an affidavit. He had filed the suit because enough is enough. But winning in court is not the same as winning in the court of public opinion. The allegations, once made, could never truly be erased. The dismissal left an uneasy silence. No vindication, no apology, just the quiet end of a legal battle that had consumed the family for nearly a year. The church moved forward. Sarah recovered. Jakes remained chairman of the board, continuing his work with the T.D. Jakes Foundation and his new podcast partnership. But the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. A dynasty built on faith, charisma, and relentless ambition was now being tested in ways no one had anticipated. The succession was supposed to be a celebration of legacy. Instead, it had become a reminder that no empire, not even one built by a man who rose from a storefront church in West Virginia to the cover of Time magazine, is immune to the forces that tear things down. The Potter's house still stood. The congregation still filled the pews. But the foundation had been shaken. The heart attack was a warning. The transition was a promise. But what came next would force everyone to ask the question that no one wanted to answer. Had the dynasty survived, or had it merely postponed its reckoning? If you enjoyed this documentary, like the video and subscribe for more true celebrity stories every week. The announcement was made. The successors were named. The legal battles were dismissed. On the surface, everything had been resolved. Jakes had survived the heart attack. Sarah had survived the trampoline accident. The transition had been completed. The dynasty had been secured. But as the dust settled, an unsettling question lingered in the air, one that no statement, no service, and no lawsuit could fully answer. In October 2025, nearly a year after filing the defamation lawsuit against Dwayne Youngblood, T.D. Jakes quietly dismissed the case. The notice was brief, almost clinical, of voluntary dismissal by consent of all parties. There would be no trial, no courtroom vindication, no dramatic conclusion, just silence. For a man who had spent his life fighting for justice, this was an unusual retreat. The allegations had never been proven. Jakes had vehemently denied them, calling the accusations knowingly and flagrantly false and stating he was repulsed by these defamatory accusations. But the fight had taken its toll. The dismissal left an uneasy vacuum. No resolution, no apology, just the quiet end of a legal battle that had consumed the family for nearly a year. The lawsuit had always been more than a legal dispute. It was a reflection of the weight Jakes carried, the burden of a legacy under attack. The lawsuit itself had claimed that Youngblood's intentional and malicious lies had taken a substantial emotional and physical toll on Jakes and directly connected the allegations to the heart attack he suffered on November 24, 2024. The stress of defending his reputation had been intertwined with the physical collapse that nearly killed him. But now, with the case dismissed, the accusations remained unresolved in the public consciousness. No vindication, no recantation, just the quiet withdrawal of a legal fight that had once seemed so urgent. Sarah Jakes Roberts, meanwhile, faced her own trial. The trampoline accident in April 2026 had nearly paralyzed her. She described hearing several pops in her neck as she landed, her daughter calling 911, 2 hospitals, several scans, and the terrifying diagnosis: fractured neck, herniated discs, endangered areas of her spine. 1 disc up or 1 disc lower. And this would have been a different testimony, she wrote. She would wear a neck brace for 4 to 6 weeks. The woman who had just been entrusted with the future of a 30,000-member megachurch was now fighting to walk again. The irony was devastating. Just months after her father had nearly died on stage, Sarah faced her own brush with mortality. The transition, once celebrated as a triumph, had become a crucible. Jakes had handed over leadership in July 2025 during a nearly 4-hour installation service filled with ministers, elders, and deacons. "This is legacy," he had told the congregation. "Not because they are kin, but because they are the kind." Sarah had wept as she spoke. "I've been wondering if I have what it takes," she confessed. Now, less than a year later, The weight of that question pressed down harder than ever. Could she truly lead a church while recovering from a near-paralyzing injury? Could the dynasty survive without its founder? The church issued a statement. She would make a full recovery, but she would be scaling back public appearances. The new senior pastor, barely settled into her role, was suddenly sidelined. And yet, the Jakes family had built something that refused to break. On the one-year anniversary of the heart attack, in November 2025, Jakes reflected on the experience in a podcast episode titled The Next Chapter. He spoke not just about the physical trauma, but about the emotional honesty required to survive it. He referenced neuroscience and trauma literature, breaking down how the body responds to stress, grief, and unexpected change. "I will never stop preaching," he had insisted during the transition. And he meant it. He continued as chairman of the board and spiritual overseer, working with his foundation and his new podcast partnership. The empire still stood. The family still held. But the unanswered question remained, the one that had been there from the very beginning. The one that viewers had been asking since that November day in 2024. The one that the lawsuits, the succession, and the near-death experiences had only deepened. What truly happened to T.D. Jakes? Not just in the hospital, but in the months of silence that followed. The heart attack was real. The lawsuit was real. The transition was real. But beneath all of it, there was a mystery that no press release could fully explain. A man who had counseled presidents and built a global empire had almost died on stage, surrounded by 30,000 witnesses. His daughter had nearly been paralyzed. His reputation had been attacked. And through it all, he had emerged, changed, transformed, calling himself Bishop Lazarus, a man raised from the dead. The story is not over. It never is. Behind the headlines, the diagnoses, and the announcements, there is always more to uncover. The questions that remain unanswered are often the ones that matter most. And for T.D. Jakes, the man who stood at the edge of eternity and came back, the final chapter has yet to be written.